The wind howled through the open fields, kicking up spirals of dust along the dirt road leading to Henry Callahan's ranch. The old farmer, 72 years of age, sat behind the wheel of his rusted blue pickup truck, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel with quiet determination. Behind him, in a rickety old trailer, stood a horse, if one could even call it that. The poor creature was nothing but skin and bones, its ribs jutting out like an old wooden fence, its once proud coat now dull and covered in patches of dirt. Every bump in the road made the animal stumble, its legs barely strong enough to hold its own weight. As Henry pulled into the ranch and brought the truck to a stop near the stables, a group of local farmers leaned against the wooden fence, watching with curiosity. It was their daily routine to gather and chat about the day's work, trading stories and sharing laughs. But the moment Henry stepped out of his truck and walked toward the trailer, all conversation ceased. As soon as he unlatched the door and led the horse out, silence was quickly replaced by an eruption of laughter. "Oh, come on, Henry. Tell me you didn't actually pay for that sack of bones." Tom Jenkins, a grizzled rancher with a booming voice, called out between chuckles. "That ain't a horse, that's a walking skeleton," added Pete, wiping a tear from his eye. "You would have been better off buying a stuffed bear." More laughter followed. Some of the men shook their heads in disbelief, others pointed at the miserable animal as if the whole thing were some kind of joke. Henry, however, remained silent. He stood beside the horse, gently running his rough, calloused hand down its frail neck. Rusty, that's what he had decided to call him, didn't flinch, didn't resist. His eyes, sunken and lifeless, spoke of years of neglect and suffering. He had already been written off by the world. Henry sighed and tightened his grip on the rope. Then, in a voice that carried both conviction and quiet defiance, he spoke. "Laugh all you want, but I see something in him that you don't." With that, he turned and led Rusty into the stable, ignoring the lingering echoes of amusement behind him. The men at the fence exchanged smirks and knowing looks, already convinced that Henry had made the biggest mistake of his life. To them, this horse was worthless, a waste of time, money, and effort. But they had no idea what was coming. And soon, they would all be eating their words. The stable was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of hay and the distant calls of birds settling in for the night. Rusty stood in the dim light, his frail body barely holding itself together. His legs trembled with every shift of weight, and his dull eyes stared blankly at the wooden walls, as if he had already given up. Henry Callahan watched him closely, leaning against the stall door, his old hands resting on his belt. The horse's condition was worse than he had imagined. Malnourished, weak, and carrying scars from a past Henry could only guess at, Rusty was a shadow of what he once had been. But there was something in the way the horse still stood, however unsteadily, that told Henry one thing. There was still fight left in him. Henry let out a slow breath and walked to the corner of the stable, grabbing a fresh bale of hay. He tore some loose strands and placed them in front of Rusty, stepping back to see if the horse would eat. But Rusty didn't move. He didn't even sniff the food. Henry crouched down beside him, his voice calm and steady. "Come on, boy. You gotta try." Rusty flicked an ear but didn't react otherwise. Henry sighed. He had seen this before, not just in animals, but in men, too. Soldiers who had returned from war, eyes hollow, spirits shattered. Henry himself had known that darkness once. The feeling of being used up, tossed aside, left to wither. He wasn't about to let this horse fall into the same fate. The first few days were a battle. Rusty barely touched his food, and when Henry led him outside into the paddock, the horse moved sluggishly, his head hanging low. The other horses on the ranch, strong and proud, trotted around with ease, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. Rusty was a stark contrast, a living ghost among them. The other ranchers continued to laugh whenever they saw Henry struggling to get Rusty to take a few steps. "Give it up, Henry," Tom Jenkins called from the fence, shaking his head. "That horse ain't worth the trouble. Some things just can't be fixed." Henry didn't look up. He simply ran his hand down Rusty's neck, feeling the sharp bones beneath the thin layer of skin. He knew the road ahead would be long, painful even. But if there was one thing Henry Callahan believed in, it was second chances. He had been given one once, a lifetime ago, when everyone else had given up on him. Now, it was Rusty's turn. That night, as the ranch fell silent under a blanket of stars, Henry sat outside the stable, listening to the slow, steady breathing of the horse inside. He knew the men in town expected Rusty to collapse within days, to become just another failed cause. But Henry wasn't a man who cared about what others thought. He had made a promise, to himself, to Rusty, and he intended to keep it. And in the darkness of the stable, Rusty, for the first time, took a slow, cautious bite of hay. The morning sun bathed the ranch in a soft golden light as Henry Callahan made his way to the stables. His boots pressed into the damp earth, the scent of hay and morning dew filling the air. He didn't rush. He never did. Years of working the land had taught him that patience was more valuable than strength. But today, as he approached Rusty's stall, a small part of him braced for disappointment. He half expected to find the horse collapsed, too weak to stand, proving everyone right. But when he reached the wooden stall door and peered inside, Henry stopped in his tracks. Rusty was standing. His legs were shaky, his ribs still far too prominent, but he was standing. Not only that, beside the feeding trough, the pile of hay had noticeably diminished. Henry's sharp eyes caught the signs immediately. Rusty had eaten more than the day before. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Henry exhaled slowly, stepping inside. He ran a rough, calloused hand down the horse's bony neck, feeling the warmth of his skin, the faintest tremor of exhausted muscles. "Told you, boy. You just needed time." Outside, the morning routine of the ranch had begun. The other farmers were already gathering at the fence, as they did every day, ready for their usual spectacle. The moment Henry stepped out with Rusty, the chuckles and murmurs started. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom Jenkins drawled, leaning on the railing. "He's still upright. Didn't think he'd last the week." The men around him chuckled, shaking their heads. To them, this was just a stubborn old man clinging to a lost cause. But Henry wasn't listening. He had spent a lifetime learning to tune out the voices of men who had never built anything, only torn things down. Rusty was more than a broken-down horse to him. He was a reflection of something deeper, something that only those who had known true struggle could understand. Determined to push the horse further, Henry led him into the open paddock. The morning sun cast long shadows as Rusty hesitated at the threshold, his hooves sinking slightly into the soft dirt. He lifted his head, his ears twitching, his eyes scanning the space around him. It was as if he didn't quite believe he belonged out there. Henry gave the lead rope a gentle tug. "Come on, Rusty. Just a little more." At first, nothing. The horse remained frozen, his muscles stiff, his breath shallow. Henry didn't rush him. He simply stood there, waiting. And then, Rusty exhaled a deep, heavy breath, his nostrils flaring as if shaking off invisible chains. Slowly, carefully, he took a step. Then another. The movements were awkward, unsteady, but they were his. Henry felt his throat tighten. He knew what he had just witnessed. It wasn't just a step. It was the moment Rusty decided to fight back. The morning air was crisp as Henry stepped into the paddock, the damp earth still holding the chill of the night before. He held Rusty's lead rope loosely in his hand, watching the horse with patient eyes. The previous day had been a victory, small, but significant. Rusty had moved on his own, had chosen to take those hesitant steps. But Henry knew that wasn't enough. A horse wasn't meant to merely stand or shuffle forward. A horse was meant to run. And today, Rusty would have to push beyond the pain that had kept him captive for so long. The other ranchers were already gathered at the fence, as they were every morning, their usual smirks and chuckles barely concealed. Tom Jenkins, ever the loudest, crossed his arms and leaned forward. "So, what's the plan today, Henry?" he called out, his voice dripping with amusement. "You gonna teach that bag of bones how to fly?" A few of the men laughed, but it was quieter this time. The way Rusty had lasted this long had caught some of them off guard. Still, none of them truly believed the horse had anything left in him. But Henry did. He took a step back, loosening his grip on the rope even further, his eyes never leaving Rusty. The horse stood still, his thin chest rising and falling, his ears flicking toward the distant sounds of birds and the rustling of trees. He was alert, aware. But something still held him back. Fear, perhaps. Or exhaustion. Maybe both. "You can do this, boy," Henry murmured softly. His voice carried the weight of experience, of understanding. He knew what it was like to feel broken, to be told you weren't good enough. But he also knew what it meant to prove them wrong. Rusty hesitated, his hooves pressing into the dirt. His muscles, weak from months, maybe years, of neglect, quivered under his own weight. But then he moved. It was just a step at first, slow and uncertain. Then another. The lead rope slackened as Rusty took another few cautious strides forward. Henry held his breath, his heart pounding. He wasn't pulling him, wasn't forcing him. Rusty was choosing to walk. To try. From the fence, the laughter had stopped entirely. The ranchers were silent now, watching with something Henry had hoped to see, respect. They had expected Rusty to give up, to collapse from exhaustion. But he hadn't. He was still standing, still moving, still fighting. Henry walked beside him, his own steps slow and steady. He reached out, gently running a hand down Rusty's neck, feeling the warmth of life beneath his fingertips. There was still a long road ahead. Rusty was far from strong, far from the proud stallion he had once been. But Henry wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for heart. And in that moment, watching Rusty take those uncertain steps toward something greater, Henry knew one thing for certain. This horse wasn't done yet. The days turned into weeks, and Rusty's progress was slow but undeniable. Each morning, Henry led him out into the paddock, and each morning, the horse took more steps than the day before. The once skeletal frame of the animal had begun to fill out, thanks to Henry's careful feeding and endless patience. His coat, though still dull in places, had lost the lifeless grayish hue it had when he first arrived. And most importantly, there was something different in his eyes, a spark. It wasn't just Henry who noticed the change. The other ranchers, the same men who had laughed at Rusty's arrival, had stopped mocking altogether. They still gathered at the fence each morning, but now they watched in silence. Some even leaned forward slightly, as if unwilling to admit they were invested in the outcome. Even Tom Jenkins, always the first to make a joke, had grown quieter in recent days. One afternoon, as Henry led Rusty around the paddock, he decided to take a chance. He stopped walking and gave the rope a gentle flick, signaling the horse to move ahead on his own. Rusty hesitated, his ears twitching backward. For a moment, it looked like he might freeze, might retreat into himself like he had so many times before. But then he snorted, lifted his head slightly, and took a step. Then another. Then, without warning, Rusty broke into a trot. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't graceful. His legs were still weak, his body still recovering. But the movement was there, the instinct still alive somewhere deep inside him. Henry felt his throat tighten as he watched the horse push himself forward, as if remembering what it meant to be free. From the fence, a voice finally broke the silence. "Well, I'll be damned." It was Tom Jenkins. But this time, there was no mockery in his tone. No sarcasm. Just pure, stunned disbelief. Rusty slowed after a few strides, breathing hard, his body glistening with sweat. He wasn't strong yet, not by a long shot, but Henry knew this moment meant everything. Rusty hadn't just walked or obeyed a command. He had run. And for the first time, Henry truly believed that one day he would run like he was meant to. The other ranchers exchanged glances, the shift in their expressions undeniable. Doubt was beginning to turn into something else entirely. Henry gave Rusty a firm pat on the neck and looked toward the men at the fence. "Told you boys, this horse ain't done yet." The sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the paddock as Henry wiped the sweat from his brow. Rusty stood beside him, sides heaving from the effort of the day's training. The old horse had done more than just walk today. He had run. Not fast, not far, but enough to silence the voices of doubt that had lingered over the ranch for weeks. Henry could feel it in the air. The shift. The quiet respect replacing the laughter. For the first time since Rusty had arrived, Tom Jenkins wasn't leaning against the fence with a smirk. Instead, he was watching, really watching. His arms were crossed, his lips pressed into a thin line. The usual amusement in his eyes was gone, replaced by something Henry hadn't expected to see: contemplation. "You really think he'll be strong enough to ride?" Tom finally asked, his voice gruff, hesitant. The other ranchers turned to Henry, waiting for his response. They weren't mocking him anymore. Now, they were curious, maybe even hopeful. Henry glanced at Rusty, who was still catching his breath, but there was something different about him now. His head was held just a little higher, his ears pricked forward, as if he were beginning to believe in himself, too. Henry gave the horse a firm pat on the neck before turning back to Tom. "I don't think it. I know it." The words hung in the air, heavy with certainty. A few of the men exchanged glances, some nodding subtly. No one dared to argue. Over the next few days, Henry pushed Rusty further. The walks turned into trots, the trots into short, shaky gallops. The first time Rusty reached a full stride, his hooves kicking up dirt as he moved across the paddock, Henry felt something swell inside his chest, a pride so deep it nearly brought tears to his eyes. The ranchers at the fence barely spoke anymore. They simply watched, as if witnessing something they had never thought possible. Then came the real test. The saddle. Henry knew Rusty had been ridden before, but not kindly. The scars on his back told stories that the horse couldn't speak aloud. And so, on the morning of the test, Henry didn't rush. He spent extra time brushing Rusty down, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. When he finally lifted the saddle onto Rusty's back, the horse tensed but did not bolt. He flinched, but he didn't fight. Henry fastened the straps carefully, never breaking his steady rhythm. He stepped back, watching Rusty's ears flick toward him, waiting for a sign of panic. But there was none. Then, for the first time since the day he had arrived, Rusty turned his head toward Henry and nudged his shoulder. Henry froze. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It was trust. And trust was something no one could ever take away again. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh hay and damp earth as Henry stood beside Rusty in the paddock. The saddle was already fastened, snug but not tight, and Rusty stood still, his ears flicking slightly as if waiting for what would come next. Henry could feel the anticipation in the air. The other ranchers had gathered again, but this time there was no laughter. No jeering remarks. Only silence. They had all seen Rusty's transformation, seen him go from a frail, lifeless creature to a horse that had begun to rediscover his strength. But none of them believed Henry would actually ride him. Henry exhaled slowly, placing a firm but gentle hand on Rusty's neck. "All right, boy. Time to show 'em what you got." He grabbed the saddle horn and placed his boot in the stirrup. For a moment, Rusty tensed, his muscles coiling beneath his thin frame. Henry knew this was the real test. The horse had learned to walk, to trot, even to gallop again, but would he allow himself to be ridden? Or would his past come flooding back, sending him into panic? Carefully, Henry swung his leg over and settled into the saddle. Rusty shifted beneath him but did not bolt. The ranchers held their breath, waiting for the moment when the horse would rear, when he would prove them right by failing. But Rusty only stood there, his breathing slow, his ears tilting backward, listening. Then, Henry gave the lightest nudge with his heels. Rusty moved. At first, it was just a step. Then another. The old horse's gait was stiff, uncertain, but he obeyed. Henry guided him in a slow walk around the paddock, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind tugged at his hat, and the sound of hooves against the packed dirt echoed in the silence. No one spoke. The disbelief was almost tangible. Halfway around the paddock, Henry felt something shift. Rusty's steps became smoother, his neck relaxed. And then, without any coaxing, he picked up speed. The watching ranchers straightened, their eyes widening. Rusty wasn't just walking anymore. He was trotting. It was awkward, a little shaky, but it was real. The same horse they had called a bag of bones was now carrying a rider, moving as if he had never been broken at all. Henry couldn't stop the smile that spread across his face. He leaned forward slightly, patting Rusty's neck. "That's it, boy. You remember now, don't you?" And deep in Rusty's dark eyes, Henry swore he saw something that hadn't been there before. The sound of hooves against the dirt filled the morning air as Rusty trotted across the paddock, carrying Henry with more confidence than anyone had expected. The old horse's steps were still a little stiff, his muscles still rebuilding from years of neglect, but there was no mistaking it. He was moving with purpose. Every stride was a silent defiance against the past, against the laughter, against the doubt that had surrounded him since the day Henry brought him home. The ranchers at the fence, the same men who had mocked Rusty's arrival, stood frozen, their arms resting on the wooden rails, their eyes locked onto the horse that had once seemed like a lost cause. No one spoke. No one laughed. They had come expecting to see a failure, a reminder of why some things weren't worth saving. But what they were witnessing now was something none of them had anticipated, a resurrection. Tom Jenkins was the first to break the silence. "I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. His voice was quiet, but Henry heard it, and from the way some of the other men nodded slowly, he knew they were all thinking the same thing. But Henry wasn't interested in proving anything to them anymore. He focused on Rusty, on the way the horse moved beneath him. The old stallion wasn't just obeying commands, he was remembering who he was. Henry loosened the reins slightly, letting Rusty take control. The horse flicked his ears, and for a split second there was hesitation. But then it happened. Rusty galloped. It wasn't perfect. His strides weren't as smooth as they once had been, and his body was still regaining its former strength. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that he was running. Not because he had to. Not because he was being forced. But because he wanted to. A rush of wind hit Henry's face as Rusty's hooves dug into the earth, his breath coming in strong, rhythmic bursts. The power was there. It had always been there, buried beneath years of pain and mistreatment. Now, it was finally breaking free. At the fence, one of the younger ranchers exhaled in disbelief. "That's impossible." But it wasn't. Rusty was proving that right now. Henry leaned forward slightly, lowering a hand to pat Rusty's neck. The horse didn't flinch. He didn't shy away. Instead, he pushed forward, faster, as if embracing this new beginning with everything he had left. And in that moment, Henry knew, Rusty's story was far from over. Rusty thundered across the paddock, his hooves kicking up clouds of dust as he galloped with newfound strength. Henry could feel the power beneath him, the raw energy of a horse that had been to the edge of defeat and fought his way back. It was almost as if Rusty was running to prove something, not just to the ranchers watching in stunned silence, but to himself. The wind roared in Henry's ears, and for a brief moment, he wasn't a 72-year-old rancher riding a once-broken horse. He was young again, racing across the fields like he had in his prime, feeling the unbreakable bond between man and beast. A lifetime of memories flooded his mind. The first horse he had ever tamed, the first time he had felt the pure freedom of riding with no destination, no fear, just the rhythm of hoofbeats beneath him. And now, here he was, living it again. At the fence, the ranchers stood frozen. No one dared to speak, no one dared to blink, as if the slightest movement would shatter the reality of what they were witnessing. Tom Jenkins had his hands gripping the top rail so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The skepticism that once filled his face had vanished, replaced by something Henry never thought he'd see: respect. "Would you look at that?" Tom murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "That damn horse proved us all wrong." Henry slowed Rusty to a trot, then to a walk, giving the horse a moment to recover. Rusty's chest heaved, his body slick with sweat, but there was something different about him now. His head was held high. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, now gleamed with something Henry had been waiting to see: pride. Henry dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dirt as he patted Rusty's side. The horse turned his head toward him and did something that nearly brought a lump to Henry's throat. He nuzzled Henry's shoulder. It wasn't out of fear. It wasn't out of obedience. It was gratitude. From the fence, the other ranchers began stepping forward. One by one, they approached, no longer looking at Rusty with pity or mockery, but with admiration. One of the younger men finally spoke. "I never thought I'd see the day. But damn, Henry, you did it." Henry turned, meeting their eyes with a quiet, satisfied grin. "No, boys," he said, giving Rusty one last pat. "He did it." And at that moment, everyone knew, Rusty wasn't just a horse that had been saved. He was a horse that had saved himself. The ranch had never been so quiet. For weeks, the men who gathered by the fence had laughed, shaking their heads every time Henry led Rusty out, convinced the old horse was a lost cause. But now, they stood in silence, their faces reflecting something entirely different: respect. Rusty, once a frail shadow of a horse, now stood tall in the paddock, his breathing steady, his ears pricked forward, his chest rising and falling with the deep rhythm of an animal that had found himself again. He was still lean, his ribs faintly visible beneath his coat, but there was power in his stance now, a presence. He no longer looked like a creature waiting to fade away. He looked like a horse that had fought for his place in this world. Henry, standing beside him, ran a hand down Rusty's neck, feeling the warmth of life beneath his fingers. He had spent months nursing this animal back from the brink, pushing through every moment of doubt, every whisper that told him to give up. But Henry had always known the truth. Rusty wasn't just any horse. He was a survivor. Tom Jenkins was the first to break the silence. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, removing his hat and rubbing the back of his neck. His voice, once filled with mockery, now held something that Henry never expected to hear: genuine admiration. He looked at Rusty, then at Henry, shaking his head. "I ain't never seen nothin' like this before." The other ranchers murmured in agreement. Some nodded, others simply stared, as if still trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The transformation had been undeniable. Rusty had gone from a lifeless, broken-down animal to a horse that moved with strength, purpose, and dignity. Tom took a deep breath, hesitating before speaking again. "Guess I owe you an apology, Callahan." His words were slower this time, careful, as if choosing them with more weight than usual. "Hell, I think we all do. We wrote him off before he ever had a chance. But you," he paused, glancing at Rusty. "You saw something we didn't." Henry chuckled softly, still running his fingers through Rusty's mane. "Wasn't about proving anything to you, Tom." He looked down at the old horse, who flicked an ear toward the sound of his voice. "It was about proving it to him." The men nodded, their expressions shifting from disbelief to quiet acknowledgement. They had spent their lives working with animals, breaking horses, raising cattle. But this wasn't just about training. This was about redemption. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, bathing the ranch in streaks of deep orange and gold, Henry stepped back and looked around at the faces of the men who had once doubted him. Not a single one of them laughed now. Not a single one of them could deny what they had seen. Rusty had not just recovered. He had defied every expectation, every assumption, every whispered doubt. One of the younger ranchers, who had spent most of the last few months watching from the sidelines, finally spoke up. His voice was quiet but filled with something close to reverence. "That ain't just a horse anymore." He shook his head. "That's a damn miracle." Henry smiled. "No, son," he said, patting Rusty's side one last time. "That's just what happens when you give someone a second chance." Rusty let out a deep, contented breath, shifting his weight as he stood beside Henry. He had been discarded, left for dead, written off as nothing. But now, he was something else entirely. Not just a horse, not just a survivor. He was proof that sometimes the ones everyone gives up on are the ones who rise the highest. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Henry led Rusty back toward the stables. The other men watched as the old rancher and his horse walked side by side, the bond between them unspoken but stronger than words. No one doubted anymore. Because that day, Rusty had not just regained his strength. He had become a legend.